वेलकम एवरीवन। सबको नमस्कार। हैप्पी इंडिपेंडेंस डे। देवतनु जी पहले इंडिपेंडेंस डे बोल चुके हैं, पर आई थिंक वी हैव लॉस्ट हिम फॉर सम रीजन। बट अगेन आप सबका स्वागत है संवाद क्रिटिक एंड इंडिक पर्सपेक्टिव दिस मंथ एडिशन ऑर्गेनाइज्ड बाय युवा। हेलो, yeah, hello. So this has been organized by Yuva Now. Yuva, as you know, is the youth. First of all, I'll request everyone to mute their microphones, please. Yes. So Yuva, as you know, is the Youth United for Vision and Action. It's an organization that works to create and support space for free speech and dialogue and to fight and create an intellectual discourse within the academia. And previously we had various speakers and guests. We had General Dhruv Katoch from India Foundation who spoke, and we had Sushil Pandit. Last month we had Sri Radheshamji, Minister for Education, Labour and Employment from Government of Manipur. The purpose of this talk, as I said, was to inform and educate the students, and students, as we know, are very perceptible to the narrative, which frankly has been dominated by the left. So in that way, we want to reach out to the young speakers, and we want to talk about the historical as well as contemporary facets of India as a country as well as a civilization. So this is important where we want to include and we want to inform about the Indian perspective on these issues, for instance, the nationalism, the Benedict Anderson narrative, or what the Western narrative. So, in that light, today's theme is India's stress with civilization nationalism. And our speaker today, he has been a very anticipated guest and a very popular figure within our group, within our circles, sharing his work. He has been unique in its own way. Meaning, apart from the fact that he's one of the youngest speakers here, and is the coverage of issues that he covers: civilizational, cultural, historical, and religious, and of course the issue of Kashmir. And these are delicacies with the young people, and frankly, with our generation. So his work has been popular. Mr. Daha is the co-founder of the Oxford Foundation in Calcutta, and he also is the head of the operations at the Indie Collective Trust. I would like to call Mr. Ashit Daha for this. I'll welcome him, but before that, again, an administrative announcement. Please mute your microphones and use the chat box to put down your questions, and so that we can gain as much time with our speaker, and utilize most of his time. Uh, Mr. Ashit Daha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prabhatji. Am I clearly audible?
Yes, sir.
Right. So, thank you, first of all, to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak to this young and energetic, hopefully, uh, hopefully, uh, the bright future of the country is in the hands of uh, young students like you. So hopefully this session will not be yet another boring session on an abstract topic that you are made to attend just for the sake of whatever earning credits or whatever. And I'll try and make it as useful as possible. Um, and I will hope that there will be sufficient time for a bit of interaction as well, and I'd be happy to answer some questions within the limits of the time, of course. And Before I get into the meat of the topic, I would first like to wish everyone a happy Independence Day, Vande Mataram. And I think that this is an apt occasion for the topic that you've chosen for today, which is civilizational nationalism. And No better day than 15th August to speak about it, given that this momentous day is when we first of all got our political independence, freedom from colonial rule, and when Swaraj was established. Um, so I think the journey, as we speak in our in our circles, we've often discussed the meaning and consequence of attaining Swaraj. And I think that we are still a fair distance away from Swatantra, from being Swatantra. So, although this is called the Swatantrata Divas, but I would think that this is just this. This should more aptly be titled as Swarajya Divas, because this is the day when we attained self-rule. But Swatantra is when we rule according to our own civilizational ethos, and I think that we are a fair distance away from that, which is why these discussions are important. Uh, that this churn which is happening today, not just today as in literally speaking, today as in our interaction, but in the times that we live in, where people are talking about alternative means of solving uh, the crises that the world is engulfed with, multiple crises, whether it is ecological, whether it is political, economical, I mean, all kinds of stuff that we are faced with. So I do believe, like many of our fellow Indians, that India does have a critical role to play in the future of the planet itself, in a safe and a bright future for the planet. Um, and in that context, how we define ourselves and our nationhood becomes extremely important. Um, and I'll come to that in a while. So before uh, before we get into what nationalism is, I think we should first digress a little into the what nationalism or what any collective enterprise means to an individual. And elementary political science that we are taught in middle school tells us that there are a set of rights and a set of duties that each of us has, I mean, has access to. So there's a set of rights that we are entitled to, and a set of duties that we are obligated to fulfill. Um, as the words themselves make it abundantly clear, rights come from a sense of entitlement, right? And it's, um, I mean, the translation for rights in Sanskrit or Hindi is roughly adhikar, but it is not the same thing. Adhikar is also authority, and adhikar has other connotations that rights don't. Rights is basically a very specific term which basically uh, grants an individual certain benefits and certain privileges that a political system grants on the individual. And because rights are essentially for the benefit of the individual and come from a sense of entitlement, uh, we are all um, more than happy to demand for our rights and press for those rights. Um, However, like I said before, duties come from the obligation uh, that we have towards the collective. And this obligation is defined based on the understanding of our relationship with the collective. So, unless we have a clear sense of how we are related to the larger society around us, whether it is the local community, whether it is at the state level or at the national level or even at the international level. Given that I'm speaking to an audience which is from a university that is an international university, so even with the international community, the relationship between the individual and the community determines the obligations that the individual has towards the community. Um, so in that sense, it's very important to understand what nationalism really means and our relationship to the nation and how that really affects our sense of duty. We all grow, in India especially, we all grow in an atmosphere where everyone is asking for rights, but no one is really willing to fulfill their responsibilities. this is more so, this is more visible in post-colonial societies where there is a history of trauma from the colonial period, and people do not have a clear understanding of this relationship with the collective, and therefore the duties part always takes a backseat, and the systemic problems that we encounter every day, whether it is corruption, whether it is bad governance, all kinds of malpractices in commerce, all this comes from a lack of understanding of the relationship with the collective, and therefore a total disregard of the duties one is obligated to fulfill. So let's go to first principles again, because that's where the relationship needs to be established first, and try and understand what really makes a nation. Uh, in the most basic, fundamental terms, a nation is made of, the constituents of a nation are its geography, its culture, and its history. And all these three elements are interdependent and inform each other. So a geography is the most fundamental of these aspects because it's the physical manifestation of the concept, the most gross physical at the physical plane. So in India, we talk about the Indian nation as between the modern Indian nation between Kashmir and Kanyakumari and Gujarat and Arunachal Pradesh. So that defines the physical expanse of the Indian nation. And the geography consists of course, the mountains, the forests, rivers, the various landscapes. Um, and this geography has an impact on culture. So we know that, there's there are different states in India with different geographical features. For example, Himachal Pradesh has a very different culture from, let's say, Rajasthan, which is a desert. Similarly, there is a huge coastline. Um, the tallest mountain range in the world is in India. There are so many perennial rivers, and so uh, all kinds of geographical features are found in our reasonably large uh, expanse of a country. Um, Now, this diversity in geography has a direct impact on the diversity of culture, right? So, the fabled cultural diversity of India basically comes from its geography. And it is also interesting that, what makes India's geography especially blessed and sacred is the fact that it allowed for a, a single culture to thrive, right? So Indians have always had a sense of cultural unity because there was the geography of the country allowed uh, Indians to intermingle, to have cultural influences between cultural exchanges between various communities. So even a text like Natya Shastra, for example, which was written in North India, and most of its commentaries were done in Kashmir. That text became the foundational text for all performing arts anywhere in India, whether it is Tamil Nadu, whether it is Kerala, whether it is Bengal. So you see, I mean, that sort of that pervasiveness of one single culture is what makes us special. What is even more special about this culture is that it has allowed the geographical, the cultural diversity that comes from the geography to thrive and survive. It hasn't imposed a single order, a monolithic vision, uh, and it has not imposed it top down on the whole length and breadth of the country. So you have diverse expressions, whether it is in language, whether it is in food, in in dance forms, in music, all kinds of stuff. Um, the third element that makes a nation that I mentioned is history. And history, if we have to define it foundationally, history is the interaction of this culture, which is found in within the which developed within the boundaries of this geography, its interaction with other cultures. Uh, and it can be safely said that history is basically a record of conquests and conflicts with other cultures. So when the Islamic invasion happened, that was a momentous, period, an epoch-making period in uh, Indian history, because that is when a massive sort of confrontation happened with a very different culture, and the results of that were no less than catastrophic in a lot of ways. Um, but in any case, what I was trying to get at is that all these three, geography, history, and culture, they they sort of inform each other and and help define each other. Um, so when I mentioned that India is an especially blessed geography, I would, I just want to make that point a little more clear because it is important. Because if you compare India with, let's say, a huge continent like Africa, right? And Africa remained isolated till the colonial times, precisely for the same reason that India was perhaps the hub of the global culture at in the pre-modern times. That uh, that is entirely attributable to the geography of Africa. So Africa, the different pockets where tribes were, different tribes were living, these pockets uh, remained pretty much isolated because of the insurmountable physical barriers between these regions, and therefore there was no pervasive culture in Africa, and which also kept it isolated from outside influences, because when the Europeans first tried to get into Africa, uh, they could not make their way past the shallow coastline, because their warships would not they could not actually come too close to the coastline, because the gradient of the coastline was such, and it did not allow for the passage of big ships. So they had to send their soldiers, or the invaders had to actually take they had to get into small boats and make their way inside the continent, and they were easily repelled by the tribes living inside. um, but this changed with the coming of the firepower, and with the technological development that happened uh, in the scientific, I mean, in the Enlightenment and scientific revolution period. And this sort of helped, the technology actually helped Europeans conquer and colonize Africa. Till then, Africa was pretty much uh, isolated, both in the sense of isolation from the outside world, and also within each other. So there was no pervasive culture. Uh, but today, when we talk about this, the modern world, we can safely say that no nation really exists in isolation. And we live in times where we are increasing. I mean, this cliche that the world is shrinking is absolutely accurate, because there is there is no place on earth where the influence of the global culture is not palpable. So that brings me to the question of modernity. We live in modern times, and modernity, in this context, in the context of nationhood, can be defined by three principal attributes. One is porous borders, that is, the sovereignty of the nation states is diminishing and is no longer as as absolute as it used to be, uh, mostly on account of global capitalism and the mushrooming of multinational corporations which do business in all corners of the world, and for them it doesn't really matter whether their place of origin or their place of establishment is America or Europe. Uh, the whole world is their playground. So global capitalism is the other feature of modernity, and the third is a consequence of this, that economics has gained primacy in uh, popular discourse and in legitimizing uh, any or in basically legitimizing any popular conception or philosophy. So anything that you think is up for questioning will have to be it'll have to pass the test of economics. It'll have to be justified on the basis of world trade. If this is not happening, if there is something which is not facilitating this global trade, then it becomes a problem. Then it does not have a place in the modern world. So, um, so that brings us to the essential conflict that of the times that we live in. We as a nation, as Indians, do have a long history of, um, you know, going back several millennia, 5,000, 10,000, whatever it is. And we have a sense of identity, we have a sense of pride, innate pride of being able to survive all these years. And having survived is uh, is proof enough that our ideas have worked. And this is no small matter. The fact that we have survived means that we have passed the test of evolution, and we've been a culture which has valued um, which has developed a wisdom that has enabled us to survive while other civilizations all around us have collapsed. They've come and gone, but we've been there. So the question now really is, in this era of globalization, where the world is seen as one unit on account of global capitalism and the other things that I talked about, what good is nationalism anyway? Let's say that, in one of my talks earlier, I asked this question, but I didn't have the time to answer it. But I asked this question that, if, let's say, if regions in the if the northeastern states, for example, if Arunachal Pradesh, if the people of Arunachal Pradesh say that we have a better future with China, right? Uh, does that they have a better future? Uh, and the logic that they could give is that China is a much bigger economy. China has a better, it has better access to resources. It's a more powerful nation state. It is more decisive, and it can give us all that India only promises us. For example, good infrastructure, roads, dams, electricity, jobs, whatever. So, what moral authority would India have of claiming that that part as ours? Similarly, you have the famous, the never-ending problem of Kashmir, where people kind of sway towards Pakistan because of religious affiliations, and they say that we are more comfortable living with Pakistan, uh, and from their perspective, uh, what right does India have to stake claim on the territory? Um, this brings us to uh, another concept which is very popular, and this phrase was, I think it was coined by President Woodrow Wilson in the 1920s or a little before that, just when the Second World War was ending. So he spoke of the right to self-determination, and it's a very, very catchy, a very powerful phrase, that people living in a certain area have the right to self-determination, which means that they can become a nation if they believe that they are distinct from the people living around them, and there is enough critical mass. They might as well define themselves as a nation. Um, Immediately after Woodrow Wilson made these statements, his own Secretary of State recorded in his writings, in his diary, which became public much later, that the president has committed a huge blunder. He says that he has this excellent knack for coinage, and he comes up with these very clever phrases which become instantly popular. But he does not know the consequences of what he has said, and he says this, and I quote him verbatim, that this coinage will lead to uh, the loss of thousands of innocent lives. Um, and in no time, the Secretary of State was proved correct, because what happened was that this phrase became viral in those days, in the pre-internet days, and everyone started claiming nationhood in Europe. So this phase of Europe became the phase of nation building, that nation building that we know of now. When small states began to claim that they were a nation, and these small countries started forming. Uh, and what happened was that Germany at that time was remilitarizing itself, and Hitler saw this as an opportunity to usurp these territories, because these were very small and almost defenseless countries who just claimed nationhood based on some vague sense of of identity, and had become nations. And in no time, Hitler ran over them and usurped their territories and started committing the all kinds of atrocities on the people. So you see, I mean, it's much more complex than it just looks. That right to self-determination. So when people of Kashmir, and especially when youngsters in India who don't have access to some of these intellectual ideas, and suddenly they are exposed to these phrases like right to self-determination, they develop a soft corner for these separatists and secessionists and terrorists in various parts of India, and think that, look, I mean, these people want to have a separate country, they should be given that right. But it is not so simple, and the consequences that it has on the rest of the country is fatal. So essentially, uh, the right to self determination is a seesaw sort of relationship, a dichotomous relationship between cohesiveness of a people and their survival. So, for example, the family, the smallest collective unit that we have, is the most cohesive, right? And then comes your muhalla, then comes your community, then comes your perhaps your caste, then comes your religion, then comes your nation. So these are all uh, ever expanding circles of loyalty. Um, so that cohesiveness, where you draw the line for nationhood, uh, is dependent on, one, of course, the cohesiveness of that entity, and secondly, whether it will be able to survive uh, in the face of um, the hostilities around you, right? So, for example, if hypothetically speaking, if Kashmir were a free country, as it was for a very temporary period at the time of the independence of the country, when Maharaja Hari Singh was still deciding whether to remain independent, or whether to accede to India, or perhaps was negotiating with the Indian government. Um, Immediately it was run over by the tribal militia from Pakistan, and the kind of stuff that they did is unspeakable in today's times. The kind of stuff that they did to the people, rapes, murders, loot, all kinds of stuff, which reminds you of the medieval era barbarism that India was subjected to. So when we talk about again right of self-determination, the critical question is whether an entity will be able to survive in a hostile territory. So Israel, for example, is surrounded by its enemies, and yet has the wherewithal to defend itself and its culture, and therefore it is correctly a nation, right? It has the right to be a nation. But any other place, any small state of India, if Goa tomorrow wants to be an independent country, uh, it is very difficult for it to survive on its own, and to even have a feasible economic setup. So, so the question to ask, really, in terms of if you want to understand India's nationhood, is what threatens India's cohesiveness as well as survival, right? Um, India's cohesiveness is age old, like I said, and when we talk about the Indic culture, that is precisely what India's cohesiveness is about, right? It has a very unique approach to binding the people of India together, the people of this land. It has been there for ages. And like I said, what is special about it is that it has encouraged diversity, and it has encouraged people to develop and to evolve in their own respective ways. There is no imposition from above, right? There is assimilation. There is cross-cultural. There is much exchange between regions, but there is no imposition from a single entity like a state or an empire, which says that no, this is how people have to live. This has never happened traditionally. Um, but in the modern times, um, India's cohesiveness uh, is precisely under threat from, and I'll not mince my words here, and I don't mean to um, insult or say anything derogatory about any religious group, but the fact remains that the two outside made global religions whose people live in India, for example, Islam and Christianity, because they live, um, uh, they've been living in India and they are legitimate citizens of India. However, sometimes they're not sometimes, very often, their loyalties are elsewhere. They very often have, like in the Khilafat movement of the 1920s, the 1920 and 21. Muslims in India very openly sided with the Khalifa and wanted them to invade India and establish the caliphate, uh, and make India part of the global caliphate. So these are all documented facts. These are not mere claims. And this loyalty towards the pan-Islamism, the global Islamic empire, is ordained by the religion itself. So there's nothing to hide about it, nothing to be ashamed about. It is just a statement of fact, and we need to take it like that, without giving way to baser emotions. So this is how it is. Likewise, the Christians in India also feel some degree of affiliation with the church, with the Vatican, or the Protestant churches, uh, and depending on the sect that they belong to, and they are sort of in alignment with their vision of the world. And when the church says that, for example, when evangelical groups like the Joshua Project, they talk about uh, adding to the flock of the Christ and increasing the number of Christians in the world. Uh, the Christians in India, at least the believing Christians, are religiously bound to serve those missions. So there is nothing surprising about it. Now that has a bearing on the cohesiveness of India, right? Uh, in terms of survival, what threatens India's survival is fairly straightforward. I don't think that much needs to be said about it. It's basically, the neighborhood, for example, China, Pakistan. These are actively hostile countries. Also, there's other things like in the global world that we live in. There are global alliances between countries, and there are people, even outside our region, that align with China or align with, like, for example, Turkey. Turkey, Pakistan, and China are kind of joining hands and sort of joining forces to create instability within India, right? So that is part of their geopolitical designs. So these are threats to India's survival. How do we, as a nation, um, based on our shared geography, shared culture, and shared history, how do we deal with these threats to cohesiveness as well as survival? And These two are, of course, interdependent. The answer to this question uh, in the traditional, I mean, not the traditional, but the received wisdom that we get in our education, and when we are taught these things, our school textbooks, and the political discourse in the country, the mainstream political discourse in the country, is this appeal to nationhood, is this appeal to nationalism, that we must become nationalists. And this nationalism is one kind of nationalism, right? There is no um, there is no clear definition of nationalism when people invoke nationalism, mostly because it's a notion. It's very intuitive, and no one really gives it much thought. And given the fact that we are constantly bombarded with these messages of nationalism, we don't really give a second thought to why we should actually, be nationalistic. Yeah, because it seems very, very obvious, and it makes complete sense. That's what we've been conditioned to believe. But this concept of nationalism is Westphalian, which comes from the Peace of Westphalia uh, in Europe. I think it's the 17th century. I keep forgetting the dates, but I think it's the 17th century when the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, which ended the long, era of wars between various tribes and clans and empires within Europe, and basically empowered European nations to take on the world, to expand their territory, and sort of paved the way for colonialism and the imperial era. So this Westphalian uh, nation state model is basically a model which was which originated in in a particular milieu of medieval Europe, and it had its own consequences. But because it gave way to colonialism and all sorts of expansionism and the plunder of the world, ultimately it led to the two world wars. And in the Second World War, it reached its high point where, Hitler went on a rampage, and anyone who was considered of an inferior race was wiped out. Um, and the most commonly cited example is that of the Jews. So when that happened, suddenly there was a realization that dawned in the European mind that nationalism is actually bad, because look what it has done to us. It made us into monsters. So from there, nationalism in the West has become a dirty word, and you can just simply not argue that it has a solid logic behind it. The fact that nationalism is not considered a good, or a noble value to espouse. But nationalism need not necessarily be derived from the Westphalian model, right? And as I have argued, not just, I mean, it's not something that I have discovered on my own. This has been argued by various uh, people, and great intellectuals and sages of India, including Swami Vivekanand, Sri Aurobindo, and uh, among the modern intellectuals, Sitaram Goel, Ram Swarup, Conrad Elst has written a lot about this. That uh, there is an alternative uh, to this territorial model, this Westphalian model of nationalism, which is civilizational in nature, and which derives its meaning and its definition and its authority from the very values that we espouse, from the values that made us who we are, and that is the civilizational model of nationalism. Um, Another thing that I wanted to talk about was this about the cohesiveness and its importance in terms of cooperation. Um, why we need that kind of cohesiveness is because, as a species, human beings are the one of the very few species that have thrived on the planet purely on account of their collaborative strategy. Their evolutionary strategy has been essentially collaborative. So, that has enabled us to survive. Otherwise, as individuals, I mean, in a jungle, we wouldn't last a day, right? So it's only cooperation that has helped us survive on the planet. And unless we clearly define who we are, and the kind of ethos that we live by, and what we want to achieve in the what civilizational vision that we have, we will not be able to survive on the planet, because there will be other uh, other thought systems, other ideologies, and other visions of nationhood, including the Westphalian nationhood, that will engulf us and that will gobble us up. We won't be able to survive unless we actually embrace that. So, uh, so this cohesiveness itself is civilization, right? And espousing for that civilizational nationhood is basically to say that we want to live by a certain code of conduct. We want to uphold certain values. We want to live in a certain way. And this is our philosophy. This is our vision for the planet. And this is what we are going to go forward with. Um the unfortunate part is that being a post-colonial society and having gone through the trauma of the colonial period, we are a sleeping giant. We are people who do not yet know enough about our own selves. We are not even, our state does not even allow us, or allow us would be too strong a statement to make, but it does not facilitate uh, an exposure to our civilizational ethos. And I think that is one of the most fundamental things that we should have been doing in Free India. That is discovering our own roots. What do we have to say about the environmental crisis that we are faced with? You know, how would our original thought, how would our civilization deal with the water crisis that is coming our way, about the pollution, about the decreasing forest cover, about contentious issues like global warming or climate change? You know, these are questions that no one has an answer for, and perhaps it would make sense for us to understand it on our own terms. Unfortunately, our own terms cannot be defined because we don't have access to the wisdom and knowledge of our own traditions. So, so the problem with us is that we cannot draw from our own wealth of experience. We cannot draw from the fact that we have survived, and there is perhaps something phenomenal in our own thought that has kept us alive for so long, and yet we are not willing to do that. So this becomes a problem on two counts. One is that, of course, we are not helping ourselves. Secondly, we are not even helping the world, which is also looking for a solution, right? um, so uh, so the civilizational aspect of nationhood is something that we need to push, and we need to discover for ourselves, and give up these ideas of European nationhood, because these ideas have failed. It is not because these ideas were born in Europe that we should reject them. I am not advocating for xenophobia and saying that no, there is some kind of supremacism involved. But the basic fact is that even Europeans have rejected European nationalism, right? There is a tendency among Europeans to form larger coalitions like the European Union because they see no point in having their individual nationhoods. While there is some reverse current also going on, like the Brexit thing happened, but these are minor movements in the larger, consciousness of the Europeans. So today we are living in times where our lives are completely dominated by technology, right? And technology has a massive power over the entire planet, right? Um, so this is my final point, and then I'll open it up for questions. The the very the very basic and primary consequence of this technological revolution and this this widespread growth of technology, and it becoming like a autonomous unit of its own. No one has a power over technology, right? No one can actually call the shots and say that no, 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 this is going in a dangerous direction. Tomorrow there'll be a nuclear bomb or something even more dreadful, we should stop research in that direction. That is just not possible now. So technology has a life of its own, a logic of its own, and no one controls the beast of technology. While the beast of technology has overpowered human societies. So this technology has a tendency uh, to level the playing field, to make it same all across cultures, right? So the technological culture, I mean, today you have phones. The same phone is used in the US. The same phone is used in China. The same phone is used in Australia. The same phone is used in India. The same kind of communication. Uh, you know, uh, the same kind of jobs, the same brands. You know, so there's this culturalization which has happened, one because of global capitalism, and second because of technology, which has made the life of all human beings almost the same. Because what technology has done is that it has separated humans from nature. And when we spoke about geography having an impact on your sense of identity as a nation, you're defining your nationhood. What technology does is that it isolates you from your geography, because you live, for example, you know, I am here in Delhi. If one of the participants is somewhere in, let's say, Himachal Pradesh, we are in different locations in different weather conditions, but we are both in perhaps the same temperature because I have switched on the AC, and so this technology has kind of made any differences in the physical environment redundant. So it has pushed us away from nature, and has enabled a global monoculture which is imposed on everyone. No one has a say. No one has the authority to reject it. You can't just say that, you know, I will not buy the, or we will not, in India we will not allow 5G to happen because it is making us too busy. That is just not possible, right? So this monoculturalization uh, is being imposed top down on society, and therefore uh, civilizational nationhood becomes even more important, because unless we put our foot down and say that these are the ethos that we are going to live by, we are actually submitting ourselves to a future of slavery, of enslavement to random forces of technology. And so the choice is really ours, and if we don't embrace our civilizational identity today, the price for this will be paid not just by our future generations, but the future generations of the entire planet, including other species as well, right? So the choice is ours, and I think I'll, stop here, and I'll open it up for any questions.
Hello.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Hello.
Ashish bhai,
May I have one question?
yeah, just hold on for a second. Ashish bhai, I have an arrangement. I think we have asked them to put questions in the chat box. So either we can go through them, I can read it to you, or you can just answer them because people have written in
If
an
you can,
elaborate.
if you can help me with reading them out so that I can, just you can take the best questions and maybe.
Sure. So Shivang Goswami, he asks that is it necessary that people should have a similar identity to make a nation, like a nation of diversity or so on? So what makes us nation? I think that has been answered by you.
Correct. So, I mean, identity itself is a fuzzy concept. Like typically in the Indic setting, identity is not exclusivist. Uh, we can have multiple identities, and we often do, right? So we could, right from the region that I am a Kashmiri, your caste identity, your sampradaya identity, whether you're a Shaiv or a Shakt or a Vaishnav, all kinds of identities coexist within us. And it is not, so that is the beauty of the Indic civilization, that it has allowed for a multiplicity of identities to thrive, yet have an underlying thread that connects each of us, And I think one of the core attributes of the Indic civilization is diversity. So if we say that what defines Indic civilization, you could say that we are almost obsessed with preserving diversity, and that's the achievement that we have. And this is reflect. I mean, why we are like that is because we have understood nature very profoundly, and we have lived in accordance with the diktats of nature, so to speak. So nature is like that. Nature allows for diversity, and diversity thrives in nature, and that is what makes nature sustainable and resilient. And so therefore the answer to that question is that it is in fact undesirable to have a single identity, uh,
So
as
there
far
is
as
a
we are concerned.
consistency as well as there is a diversity. So there's a cohesiveness between them.
Yes, so in fact, I mean, if you look at the Indic culture, it is not just a culture, it is a meta culture. It absorbs various identities and cultures within itself. So that's the genius of the Indic culture.
So the next question is from Mithun. He wants to know like instruments like Truth and Reconciliation Commission for India could these have an integral, cohesive and peaceful future? Could that lead to integral cohesiveness, increased cohesiveness?
No, I think, see, these are basic. I mean, as far as my understanding goes, these commissions and all these bodies and committees, um, they are a result of a churning. They are a result of what has happened in the background. They're a result of power plays and geopolitical interplay between different civilizations, between nations. And it is only after that has happened, after you have asserted yourself as a nation in the wider, in the global context, that you can actually demand this. And this becomes just a signal. It is never a solution. It is only a symptom. It is like a signal that we have achieved this, right? We are now forcing these guys to come on the table and discuss with us that you have plundered us, you have created troubles for us, you have destroyed our sense of identity for 200 years, you have done all sorts of horrible things to people, carried out genocides, and you need to acknowledge it, and you need to come to the table and discuss with me. So that itself is a statement that we have arrived. That is not a solution. uh, I don't see that as a solution at all. That is already a signal that you have made progress.
So next question is Ashutosh Verma. It's a little incoherent question. He says dividing India into Pakistan and East Pakistan could have solved problems, but did they? What's your point of view on these separations?
Well, these are speculative things. I mean, uh, I think we can only have opinions on these things. My personal opinion is that dividing Pakistan into two was the only option that we had at that point of time, uh, because of all kinds of things that were happening at the Eastern Front. So that was a great thing to do at that time. However, where we failed was that we did not follow through, and we did not assert ourselves as the victor in that battle and show them their place. And we let them come back and bleed us with thousand cuts again and again. So the failure was in the follow through, not, I don't think, in what transpired in 1971.
Okay. So next is from Parthatri Suhag. So he raises the question in the context of Huntington, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. So he wants to know that at the same time it predicted that India is more of a Hindu civilization, and soon in few decades it would face a fault line with the Islamic world, and especially a conflict with Sino-Islamist alliance. Do you see any substance in that prediction?
Can you repeat the last part again?
Do you see any? Okay, it would face the Hindu civilization soon in
Hmm.
few decades. It would face a fault line with Islamic world, especially a conflict with Sino-Islamist alliance. Do you see any substance in that prediction?
Oh, absolutely. That is something that we are already seeing. I mean, first of all, the claim that um, the Hindu civilization would see a fault line with the Islamic civilization is not even a claim. That is our history. That has happened like 800 years back. So that is obvious. But the fact that there is an alliance between China and part of the Islamic world, a resurgent Islamic Turkey, which is already taking place, and Pakistan playing, the middleman in between the two, that is already happening, and the threat to India is very real from that on that count.
Okay, sir. And the next is from Arun. He says, we are currently living in a time where there is a huge population that either finds it cool or savvy to reject the Indic culture, our traditions and symbols. Do you think there is a relatively new trend or it has surfaced now because of technology? I think it uh, connects to the part with the technology. So the negative consequences of technology, I think.
No, so is the question that the technology has enabled uh, uh, some new trend, and what is that new trend?
That's the question, I think. Do you think there is a new trend or it has surfaced now more because of the technology, the trends that these things are not popular, culture is not popular thing?
No, I think technology has played a fairly neutral part there, especially information technology, because the conversation that we are having today also is on account of technology only. And the internet has been the greatest blessing for the Indic civilization, because otherwise, in the hands of the secular Indian state, they had pretty much succeeded in smothering the Indic civilization forever. But out of nowhere came the internet, and people started talking to each other and realizing that, look, we have been duped for 50 years, and this is not how it was supposed to be. So the technology has played its part in both ways. Yes, overall, technology does have a negative impact on any people, any society, because it is overpowering, and it pushes us without our consent in a certain direction, like I explained. Um, but its positives are for all to make the best use of, and given the circumstances, and the fact that technological progress is an inevitability, I think it is the onus is upon us to use it to our maximum benefit.
So perhaps on how you use it and how much you use it depends on that.
Correct. How exactly you use it and how you put it in the service of your civilization is the key.
So now I think most of the questions have been exhausted. I think we take a round with the people. I think there is a person, Ashish Ganjuji. He's with us from Kashmir. He wanted to ask something. Ashish ji, आशीष आप सुन पा रहे, तो अपना ऑडियो माइक्रोफोन ऑन कीजिए. I think we are not able to get.
Meanwhile, can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. First of all, happy Independence Day to all of you. Sir, you in the beginning of your lecture, you said the definition of nation as based on the three pillars like geography, culture, and history, right?
Right.
So my question is like, if the Pakistan has the three components similar, they have similar history, they have similar culture, they have similar geography. Why there is a need of the two nations then? And one thing I want to to highlight in your talk, you said the people of Arunachal Pradesh, if they think they have better future with China, they should go with them. I think this kind of statement should not be given in such forum. And lastly, I would like to conclude by saying that best fitting model would be the hybridization of the nationalism and globalization, especially for a developing nation like India. Thank you.
Let me clarify that I didn't say that, I didn't advocate. I clearly said that uh, if the people of Arunachal Pradesh were to ask for a separate nationhood, uh, what prevents us, or what prevents them from saying that it is a legitimate demand? And I was talking about the right of self determination, and the problem in that concept. So I didn't say that Arunachal Pradesh should be given nationhood. I was hypothetically speaking, because that is the rationale that all separatist movements have. And if you don't want to engage with them and say that no, we will not allow you to ask that question, those questions will be asked in the relevant forums, like in the United Nations. They will go, like Kashmiris will go and and lobby and advocate for these things, that like they do, and even Arunachalis can do with the support of China, for example. So there is no question of looking the other way and saying no, we will not talk about it. That is the exact thing that I was saying, that if you want to encounter such demands, if you want to actually delegitimize such demands, you need to understand where they are coming from, do some kind of purva paksh, and then give them an answer in their that silences such idiotic demands. So that is one part. What was the other part of the question?
I think it was more of a comment, I think. Rohitji, you have any question?
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ashish ji, for a wonderful talk. I have a question, sir, to you.
Yes.
Sir, what's your take on the issue of a national or of a single national language, particularly in India, which is a very contentious issue? So the single language and for a whole civilization. So what's your take on this?
No, I think that anything, as far as I'm concerned, anything that is single uh, and imposed on the whole nation is unacceptable, civilizationally speaking. That just hasn't been who we are. That can never be the future also. Because, like I said, our fundamental attribute that has enabled us to survive for millennia has been diversity, which replicates the diversity of nature. We are exactly living like, I mean, if you define dharma is harmony. Dharma is what sustains you. And it is in copying and replicating the strategies of nature that we have been able to be who we are and survive all these millennia. And diversity being that fundamental attribute. So if you are saying that, in terms of something as fundamental as language, that we should have one single language, uh, that will obviously kill other languages, a lot of other languages, which is already happening. We are speaking in English, which is a foreign language right now, and it is practically imposed on all people. It has become an aspirational thing for various reasons, that people who speak in English are obviously supposed to be better educated and more intelligent or whatever. Again, that is not what I am saying. That is the general misconception that is prevalent. And so any single language is not going to do the job for us. However, that said, I think what often gets cited is the primacy of Sanskrit in the scheme of things. And Sanskrit as the link language is was a golden opportunity that we missed. I don't know how it will happen in the future. I'm not an expert on those matters, but that was something that should have been done. As was always the case, Sanskrit was the classical literary language, and by way of knowing Sanskrit, you could make sense. I, as a Kashmiri, would make sense of what a Bengali was saying, because there is so much in common. Even today, if I read classical Telugu poetry, uh, or hear some of the kritis composed by Tyagaraja, for example, I you can easily make sense of what he's saying if you focus on the Sanskrit part of that. So yeah, Sanskrit was and will be a key language for us, without it being imposed as a single language. That never was the case.
Okay, so there's a natural flow to all that. So next question, Shivam Mani Tripathi ji will ask.
Yeah. Thank you very much. My question is regarding, much of it has already been said. Ashish Bhai has also said, and few of our colleagues have also asked. But my question is regarding South Asia. Since we were taught in South Asian University, I would like to extend this question. What initially you said was that European form of nationalism or Westphalian model has been adopted, and it has already been rejected in Europe. Therefore we see that the European Union, we see that that kind of structure is trying to be formed. So what is happening, what I could understand in South Asian University was that the same model is being copied here also, and we are trying to make SARC out of, we want to make world without borders and then connect all these regions and, enjoy that kind of. But what we are missing at the basic is that this is what Samuel P. Huntington was also quoted, that, these are two different civilizations, and we cannot mix these two civilizations as a part of a European Union model and build roads and connectivity and all that. Okay, trade may be an aspect, but opening borders and all that. So I want to ask, what is your opinion on South Asia? Especially when I say South Asia, I mean the Indian subcontinent. And is it contrary, means is it a contradiction to the Indian form of nationalism that we are discussing here, civilizational national, if we go with the idea of Indian subcontinent or South Asia?
Absolutely, absolutely. What is happening is that in Europe, the tendency to give up their national identity and to coalesce as a continent is happening uh, within the boundaries of the so-called Western civilization. So they see something more in common with other nations in Europe, for example, and between them there is so much in common. Their ethos, their history, their struggles together, and so they see no point in having these artificial boundaries. But the moment they come in touch with an alien civilization, like the recent immigrant crisis, immigrants crisis in Europe, where millions of people from Syria and that region came to Europe and started settling down there. Now they are at a loss to understand what will they do with that, because here, I mean, they were a uniform civilization, and they might as well. It's like saying that, okay, we have Chhattisgarh and MP. पहले अलग थे, मतलब पहले साथ थे, फिर अलग हो गए, फिर वापस जोड़ दिए. So that can happen within the boundaries of India. But to say that we will have a European Union like setup in South Asia is to say that we will again make the same mistake of imposing their version of whatever is the right political system on us without critically examining it, without even understanding it, and without giving our own models a chance. So that is imperialism in a new bottle, and that is to be rejected lock, stock, and barrel. There is no sense in any of those things.
And I think what you said earlier also about this, he said about the SARC. So in SARC, we want to emulate the European model without any critical thinking to how it has worked or how it has failed. We has this sense of admiration towards English or towards their models, and is unfortunate. I think we have the last question from Mr. Ganjuji. If your microphone is working, and we'll wrap this up after this. I don't think he's getting us.
Maybe he can type. If
You can. Okay, I think he has typed something.
He has already typed something, I guess. There's there's an internet problem right now in Anantnag. He's from Anantnag.
oh,
From
okay.
Anantnag.
Maybe, yeah.
So he says,
Anant, if you could tell something about
Yeah.
Ashish Ganju and his work.
okay, I'll read it out what he has already written. So I think he says, we are the youth of Kashmiri Pandit living in the valley since 1990. Started an initiative, step development in our community, where our community is living in the valley. We are facing a lot of problems since 90 till today. Government does not think about us. Now we need to support our religious places that are out boundaries. Temples are destroyed. If you know more about a problem, if you want to know more about problems, and then he has a question, two questions actually. It is, why Indian government ignore Kashmiri Pandits, known migrants in valley?
No, I think the Indian government ignored Kashmiri Pandits full stop. In the valley, outside valley, in India, outside India. So, so that distinction, that distinction, I get what he's saying, because I mean he's in the valley, and it's just a handful of Kashmiri Hindus remaining in the valley, and they perhaps feel even more frustrated living in those hostile circumstances. Um, but unfortunately, the truth is that they have ignored everyone.
And I think the part of the other question is why ignore our religious places?
So yeah, so I'll answer why they have ignored us. So it will also answer why they have ignored our religious places. They have ignored us precisely because India uh, is a territorial nation. It doesn't have I mean, it doesn't believe, the Indian state does not believe that it has a responsibility towards, an obligation towards the civilization, and therefore it disregards everything, all history, all conflicts, all baggage from the colonial and the pre-colonial era. And this Nehruvian sense of nationalism is basically about preserving territory, and it is obsessed with that, and it does a good job of preserving territory. It has never given up on territory in all these years, despite all kinds of adversity. But it does not really care for the people, because the people are the carriers of this civilization. The territory is just one aspect; it's a physical thing. The people are what keep the civilization alive, and because the Indian state sees people as just a resource, a human resource, in the service of whatever economic goals that they have, or whatever other goals, and so that's all that people matter for the Indian state. If it had a civilizational sense, and if it had openly been an Indic civilizational nation state, then it would have to acknowledge the problems, and it would have to represent uh, the attacks, and all the kinds of conflicts that and the impositions that have been put on Hindus, specifically the majority religion. Take something like the right to practice your religion, right? It's worded very nicely, and it obviously sends out very good vibes. But it's, what is it basically? It is basically the right for Christians to convert in India, nothing else, because they are the ones who are benefiting from this. And organizations like the USCIRF, that Council of International, what is it, Religious Freedom, the US Council for
Religious
International
freedom.
Religious Freedom, these people are, their only job is to look at make statements about what is happening in India, and why there is religious intolerance, basically to facilitate conversion to Christianity, right? And the Indian state is not even for namesake, it is not protesting, it is not saying what business do you have, they're just being apologetic. That is because they don't care for these things. They don't care for the demographic threat, they don't care for the threat to the heritage, they don't care for losing communities losing their culture. For example, Kashmiri Hindus are on the brink of cultural extinction. Uh, no one in the government really gives a damn, and they are not even worried about natural heritage, right? So the commitment to conserving the environment, that is also thrown in the dustbin, because it doesn't really matter. I mean, that's the reason why, on an urgent basis, we have to push for uh, a civilizational nation state. Otherwise, the future is very bleak. And that is the reason, to answer the question, why they don't care about Kashmiri Hindus. Otherwise, they would have made an international issue out of the forced exodus of 500,000 people.
Okay, on that note, you said we need to do. Do you want to give just one suggestion if you have to? That these are all students learning. So, do you want to give one suggestion to them, and we'll end this?
Yeah, I mean, without being patronizing, I think it's a very bright bunch of people, going by the questions that I got. I would just suggest mildly that our tradition is to question everything. Our tradition is to go deep into uh, every concept and understand it as deeply as possible, down to our bones. And the danger of living in today's times is that we are exposed to a lot of tropes uh, that are made popular by the media, and these buzzwords and catchphrases that are thrown on us every day, and they are bombarded and they are so repetitively thrown at us that it becomes second nature for us to think in those tropes. So I think for bright minds like you guys, you need to sort of resist that temptation and go one step further at least, and perhaps several steps further, and understand everything from first principles, and do justice to your own heritage. Otherwise, we'll just like, for example, I mean, the question that I got asked, that we should not make a statement like why Arunachal Pradesh, why people of Arunachal Pradesh should not. I think I would discourage that, to put it very honestly, because these are questions that need to be confronted. I mean, you cannot just look away and say that no, this is not the right thing to say. So beware of political correctness, beware of these very shallow ideas that are thrown on you by the media, and work your way down to the core concept, the core idea, and hopefully with a sense of your own thought process that is informed by the tradition.
So thank you, Ashish Bhai, for coming and informing us. Everybody, I think most of us follows you in all your work. And those of you who do not, I would strongly recommend it, because I think what other than anything is doing to educate, and without being educated, it's hardly we can do anything, let alone preserve anything. So I think need to be educated and follow that. And I'd like to thank the whole South team, Yuva South team, helping us. The event went on a little longer than we expected, but I think that was a very interesting conversation, and electricity is also here. So I think we'll wrap it up here.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much for giving me an opportunity to speak here, and thank you for the audience to have tolerated my monologue. I hope it was useful,
Yeah,
and thanks again.
yeah. Perhaps we can have you next time,
Certainly.
new friend. Okay.
Thank you.